Committee on Oversight and Government Reform will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I want to thank Director Comey for being here and doing so on short notice. I have the greatest admiration for the FBI. My grandfather was a career FBI agent. I tell you, I'm here because we're mystified and confused by the fact pattern that you laid out and the conclusions that you reached. It seems that there are two standards, and there's no consequence for these types of activities and dealing in a careless way with classified information. It seems to a lot of us that the average Joe, the average American, that if they had done what you laid out in your statement, that they'd be in handcuffs. And they might be on their way to jail, and they probably should. And I think there is a legitimate concern that there is a double standard. If your name isn't Clinton, or you're not part of the powerful elite, that Lady Justice will act differently. It's a concern that Lady Justice will take off that blindfold and come to a different conclusion. Hillary Clinton created this mess. It wasn't Republicans, it wasn't anybody else. She made a very conscious decision. On the very day that she started her Senate confirmation, she set up and got a domain name and set up a system to avoid and bypass the safety, security, and the protocol of the State Department. Classified information is classified for a reason. It's classified because if it were to get out into the public, there are nefarious actors, nation states, others, that want to do harm to this country. And there are people who put their lives on the line, protecting and serving our country. And when those communications are not secure, it puts their lives in jeopardy. This classified information is entrusted to very few, but there is such a duty and an obligation to protect that, to fall on your sword to protect that. And yet there doesn't seem to be any consequence. You know, I was talking to Trey Gowdy, and he made a really good point with us yesterday. Mr. Gowdy said, you know, in your statement, Mr. Director, you mentioned that there was no precedent for this. But we believe that you have set a precedent, and it's a dangerous one. The precedent is if you sloppily deal with classified information, if you're cavalier about it, and it wasn't just an innocent mistake, this went on for years, that there's going to be no consequence. We're a different nation in the United States of America. We are self-critical. Most nations would never do this. But we do it in the spirit of making ourselves better. There'll be all kinds of accusations about political this and political that. I have defended your integrity every step of the way. You are the definitive voice. I stand by that. But I am mystified, and I am confused, because you listen to your fact pattern and come to the conclusion that there is no consequence. I don't know how to explain that. We'll have constituents ask us. They'll get mad. They'll pound it. You know, they're frustrated. They've seen this happen time and time again. I don't know how to explain it. And I hope that through this hearing, we can stick to the facts and understand this, because there does seem to be two standards. There does seem to be no consequence. And I want to understand that. And I want to be able to explain it to the person that's sitting at home. And that's why we're here. And so I yield back. Now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Director Comey, thank you for being here today. I want to begin by commending you and the public servants at the FBI for the independent investigation you conducted. you had a thankless task. No matter what recommendation you made, you were sure to be criticized. There's no question that you were extremely thorough. In fact, some may even say you went too far in your investigation. But of course, that was your job. That is your job. Secretary Clinton has acknowledged that she made a mistake in using a personal email account. And you explained on Tuesday that she and her colleagues at the State Department were extremely careless with their emails. But after conducting this exhaustive review, you determined that no reasonable prosecutor would bring a case based on this evidence. And you and the career staff recommended against prosecution. Based on the previous cases you examined, if prosecutors had gone forward, they would have been holding the Secretary to a different standard from everyone else. Amazingly, some Republicans who were praising you just days ago for your independence, for your integrity, and your honesty instantly turned against you because your recommendation conflicted with the predetermined outcome they wanted. In their eyes, you had one job, and one job only: to prosecute Hillary Clinton. But you refused to do so. So now you are being summoned here to answer for your alleged transgressions. And in a sense, Mr. Director, you're on trial. Contrary to the claims of your critics, there is absolutely no evidence that you made your recommendation for political reasons, no evidence that you were bribed or coerced or influenced, no evidence that you came to your conclusion based upon anything but the facts and the law. I firmly believe that your decision was not based on convenience, but on conviction. Today, House Republicans are doing what they always do, using taxpayers' money to continue investigating claims that have already been debunked just to keep them in the headlines one more day. When they hear a political siren, they rush towards it over and over again, even if the evidence is not there. Exhibit A. Majority Leader Kevin McCarthy, who admitted on national television that Republicans established the Benghazi Select Committee to bring down Secretary Clinton's poll numbers. I didn't say that. McCarthy said it. The fact was confirmed by a Republican staffer on that committee who reported that he was fired in part for not going along with the hyper-focus on Secretary Clinton. I give House Republicans credit. They certainly are not shy about what they are doing. They've turned political investigations into an art form. If our concerns here today are with the proper treatment of classified information, then we should start with a review of our previous hearing on General David Petraeus, who pled guilty last year to intentionally and knowingly compromising highly classified information. The problem is, Mr. Director, we never had that hearing. This committee ignored that breach of national security because it did not match the political goals of the House Republicans. If our concerns today were with finally addressing a broken classification system in which security levels are arbitrarily changed up and down, that would have been a legitimate goal. That would have been a valuable addition to reforming and improving our government. After all, we are the Government Reform Committee. We could have held hearings here on Zika, the Zika virus, preventing gun massacres like the one in Orlando, or a host of other topics that could actually save people's lives. But that's not why we're here. That is not why our chairman called this emergency hearing 48 hours after you made your recommendation. Everyone knows what this committee is doing. Honestly, I would not be surprised, and I say this with all seriousness, I would not be surprised if tomorrow Republicans set up a new committee to spend $7 million plus on why the FBI failed to prosecute Hillary Clinton. Director Comey, let me conclude with this request. Even with all that I have said, I believe that there is a critical role for you today. I've listened carefully to the coverage on this issue, and I've heard people say recently as this morning, 3 hours ago, that they were mystified by your decision. As a matter of fact, the chairman repeated it a minute ago. And so there is a perceived gap between the things you said on Tuesday and your recommendation. There's a gap, Mr. Director. So in this moment, and this is a critical moment, I beg you to fill the gap. Because when the gap is not filled by you, it will be filled by others. Share with us, the American people, your process and your thinking. Explain how you examine the evidence, the law, and the precedent. Describe in clear terms how you and your team, career professionals, arrived at this decision. If you can do that today, if you can do that, that could go a long way towards people understanding your decision. Finally, I want to make it clear that I condemn these completely unwarranted political attacks against you. They have attacked you personally. They have attacked your integrity. They have impugned your professionalism. And they have even suggested that you were somehow bought and paid for because you made your recommendation based upon the law and the facts. I know you are used to working in a world of politics, but these attacks have been beyond the pale. So you do not deserve this. Your family does not deserve it, and the highly skilled and dedicated agents of the FBI do not deserve it. I honor your professionalism and your service to our country. And again, even if it takes till hell freezes over, I beg you to close the gap. Tell us what happened between what you found and your decision so that not only the members of this panel and this Congress will understand, but so that Americans will understand. And if you do that, then it will be all worth it today. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
I think, hold on one second. With your indulgence, to the ranking member of which I have the greatest respect, you asked for a hearing on General Petraeus and how that was dealt with. You got it. We will have one in this Oversight Committee, and the record will reflect that in the Judiciary Committee, I repeatedly questioned Attorney General Holder. I repeatedly questioned the FBI director about the disposition of that case, probably more than any member in the House or Senate. And if you want a hearing, we'll do that.
Mr. Gentleman, you?
Yes.
Thank you.
Number two, you complained that we haven't done a hearing on Zika. The Oversight and Government Reform Committee, I believe, was the very first committee to actually do a hearing on Zika that was chaired by Mr. Micah. And I'm proud of the fact that we did a Zika hearing, and we did it first.
Gentleman, yield.
Sure.
Can we have another one because the problem is still there?
Absolutely.
Big time. Thank
Absolutely.
Mr. Chairman, I just unanimous consent request that we put the date of the hearing in the record at this time that I chaired. Thank you.
Absolutely.
On Zika.
And the ranking member knows that we have held multiple hearings on the criminal justice and criminal justice reform. You asked for it, you're passionate about it, and we did do that as well. So to suggest we haven't addressed some of those issues, I think is inaccurate.
I don't think I did that, Mr. Chairman, but again, as late as yesterday with the problem in Minnesota with an African-American man being killed, I'd like to have some hearings still on the criminal justice system. Thank you. Would
Thank
you
you,
do that?
gentlemen. Without objection, I'm going to work with you on that, as I
Thank
have
you.
every step of the way.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate
Without
it.
objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess at any time. We'll hold the record open for 5 legislative days for any members who would like to submit a written statement. We'll now recognize our distinguished witness for our first panel. Pleased to welcome the Honorable James Comey, the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations. We welcome Director Comey and thank you for being here. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses are to be sworn before they testify. If you'll please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witness answered in the affirmative. Mr. Comey, the floor is yours. You can take as long or as short as you'd like. If you have any written statement that you would like to submit afterwards, we're happy to do that as well. It will be made part of the record. The time is now yours. Director Comey, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Cummings, members of the committee. I am proud to be here today representing the people of the FBI who did this investigation as they do all their work in a competent, honest, and independent way. I believe this investigation was conducted consistent with the highest traditions of the FBI. Our folks did it in an apolitical and professional way, including our recommendation as to the appropriate resolution of this case. As I said in my statement on Tuesday, I expected there would be significant public debate about this recommendation, and I'm a big fan of transparency, so I welcome the conversation we're going to have here today. And I do think a whole lot of folks have questions about, so why did we reach the conclusion we did, and what was our thinking? And I hope very much to get an opportunity to address that and to explain it. And I hope at the end of the day people can disagree, can agree, but they will at least understand that the decision was made and the recommendation was made the way you would want it to be, by people who didn't give a hoot about politics, but who cared about what are the facts, what is the law, and how have similar people, all people, been treated in the past. Maybe I could just say a few words at the beginning that would help frame how we think about this. There are 2 things that matter in a criminal investigation of a subject. What did the person do? And when they did that thing, what were they thinking? When you look at the 100 years plus of the Justice Department's investigation and prosecution of the mishandling of classified information, those 2 questions are obviously present. What did the person do? Did they mishandle classified information? And when they did it, did they know they were doing something that was unlawful? That has been the characteristic of every charged criminal case involving the mishandling of classified information. I'm happy to go through the cases in particular. In our system of law, there's a thing called mens rea. It's important to know what you did, but when you did it, this Latin phrase mens rea means, what were you thinking? And we don't want to put people in jail unless we prove that they knew they were doing something they shouldn't do. That is the characteristic of all the prosecutions involving mishandling of classified information. There is a statute that was passed in 1917 that on its face makes it a crime, a felony, for someone to engage in gross negligence. So that would appear to say, well, maybe in that circumstance, you don't need to prove they knew they were doing something that was unlawful. Maybe it's enough to prove that they were just really, really careless, beyond a reasonable doubt. At the time Congress passed that statute in 1917, there was a lot of concern in the House and the Senate about whether that was going to violate the American tradition of requiring that before you're going to lock somebody up, you prove they knew they were doing something wrong. And so there was a lot of concern about it. The statute was passed. As best I can tell, the Department of Justice has used it once in the 99 years since, reflecting that same concern. I know from 30 years with the Department of Justice, they have grave concerns about whether it's appropriate to prosecute somebody for gross negligence, which is why they've done it once that I know of in a case involving espionage. And so when I look at the facts we gathered here, as I said, I see evidence of great carelessness, but I do not see evidence that is sufficient to establish that Secretary Clinton or those with whom she was corresponding both talked about classified information on email and knew when they did it, they were doing something that was against the law. Right? So given that assessment of the facts, my understanding of the law, my conclusion was and remains, no reasonable prosecutor would bring this case. No reasonable prosecutor would bring the second case in 100 years focused on gross negligence. And so I know that's been a source of some confusion for folks. That's just the way it is. I know the Department of Justice. I know no reasonable prosecutor would bring this case. I know a lot of my former friends are out there saying they would. I wonder where they were the last 40 years, because I'd like to see the cases they brought on gross negligence. Nobody would, nobody did. So my judgment was, the appropriate resolution of this case was not with a criminal prosecution. As I said, folks can disagree about that, but I hope they know that view, not just my view, but of my team, was honestly held, fairly investigated, and communicated with unusual transparency, because we know folks care about it. So I look forward to this conversation. I look forward to answering as many questions as I possibly can. I'll stay as long as you need me to stay, because I believe transparency matters tremendously, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Director. I'm going to recognize myself here. Physically, where were Hillary Clinton's servers?
The operational server was in the basement of her home in New York. The reason I'm answering it that way is sometimes after they were decommissioned, they were moved to other facilities, storage facilities, but the live device was always in the basement.
Was that an authorized or unauthorized location?
It was an unauthorized location for the transmitting of classified information.
Is it reasonable or unreasonable to expect Hillary Clinton would receive and send classified information?
As Secretary of State, reasonable that the Secretary of State would encounter classified information in the course of the Secretary's work.
Via email?
Sure, depending upon the nature of the system. To communicate classified information would have to be a classified rated email system.
But you did find more than 100 emails that were classified that had gone through that server, correct?
Right, through an unclassified server, correct.
Yes. So Hillary Clinton did come to possess documents and materials containing classified information via email on these unsecured servers, correct?
That is correct.
Did Hillary Clinton lie?
To the FBI, we have no basis to conclude she lied to the FBI.
Did she lie to the public?
That's a question I'm not qualified to answer. I can speak about what she said to the FBI.
Did Hillary Clinton lie under oath?
Not to the FBI, not in a case we're working.
Did you review the documents where Congressman Jim Jordan asked her specifically, and she said, quote, "There was nothing marked classified on my emails, either sent or received," end quote?
I don't remember reviewing that particular testimony. I'm aware of that being said, though.
Did the FBI investigate her statements under oath on this topic?
Not to my knowledge. I don't think there's been a referral from Congress.
Do you need a referral from Congress to investigate her statements under oath?
Sure do.
You'll have one. You'll have one in the next few hours. Did Hillary Clinton break the law?
In connection with her use of the email server, my judgment is that she did not.
Did you just not able to prosecute it, or did Hillary Clinton break the law?
Well, I don't want to give an overly lawyerly answer. The question I always look at is there evidence that would establish beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody engaged in conduct that violated a criminal statute? And my judgment here is there is not.
The FBI does background checks. If Hillary Clinton applied for the job at the FBI, would the FBI give Hillary Clinton a security clearance?
I don't want to answer a hypothetical. The FBI has a robust process in which we adjudicate the suitability of people for employment in the Bureau.
Given the fact pattern you laid out less than 48 hours ago, would a person who had dealt with classified information like that, would that person be granted a security clearance at the FBI?
It would be a very important consideration in a suitability determination.
You're kind of making my point, Director. The point being, because I injected the word Hillary Clinton, you gave me a different answer. But if I came up to you and said that this person was extremely careless with classified information, the exposure to hostile actors, and used, despite warnings, created unnecessary burdens and exposure. If they said that they had one device and you found out that they had multiple devices, if there had been email chains with somebody like Jake Sullivan asking for classification changes, you're telling me that the FBI would grant a security clearance to that person?
I hope I'm giving a consistent answer. I'm not saying what the answer would be. I'm saying that would be an important consideration in a suitability determination for anybody.
And it's just Personally, I just think that sounds like a bit of a political answer, because I can't imagine that the FBI would grant a security clearance to somebody with that fact pattern. Do you agree or disagree with that?
Just say what I said before. Again, it's very hard to answer in the hypothetical. I'll repeat it. It would be a very important consideration in a suitability determination.
Did Hillary Clinton do anything wrong?
And what do you mean by wrong?
I think it's self-evident.
Well, I'm a lawyer, I'm an investigator, and I hope a normal human being.
Do you really believe there should be no consequence for Hillary Clinton and how she dealt with this?
Well, I didn't say, I hope folks remember what I said on Tuesday. I didn't say there's no consequence for someone who violates the rules regarding the handling of classified information. There are often very severe consequences in the FBI involving their employment, involving their pay, involving their clearances. That's what I said on Tuesday, and I hope folks walk away understanding that just because someone's not prosecuted for mishandling classified information, that doesn't mean if you work in the FBI, there aren't consequences for it.
So if Hillary Clinton, or if anybody, had worked at the FBI under this fact pattern, what would you do to that person?
There would be a security review and an adjudication of their suitability, and a range of discipline could be imposed from termination to reprimand, and in between suspensions, loss of clearance. So you could be walked out, or you could, depending on the nature of the facts, you could be reprimanded. But there is a robust process to handle that.
I've gone past my time. I yield back. Now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. Director Comey, and I want to thank you very much for being here today, especially on such short notice. You and your staff should be commended for the thorough and dedicated review you conducted. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues are now attacking you personally because your final recommendation conflicted with their preconceived political outcome in this case. Some have tried to argue that this case is far worse than the case of General David Petraeus, who was convicted in 2015 of knowingly and intentionally compromising highly classified information. In fact, one very vocal politician we all know said this, and I quote, "If she isn't indicted, the only reason is because the Democrats are protecting her. She is being protected 100%. Because you look at General Petraeus, you look at all the other people that did a fraction of what she did, but she has much worse judgment than he had, and she's getting away with it, and it's unfair to him," end of quote. Director Comey, you were the director of the FBI when General Petraeus pled guilty, is that right?
Yes.
If I understand that case correctly, General Petraeus kept highly classified information in 8 personal notebooks at his private residence. Is that correct?
That is correct.
According to the filings in that case, his notebook included the identities of covert officers. They also included war strategy, intelligence capabilities, diplomatic discussions, quotes and deliberative discussions from high-level National Security Council meetings, and discussions with the President. General Petraeus shared his information with his lover and then biographer. He was caught on audio tape telling her, and I quote, "I mean, they are highly classified, some of them. They don't have it on it, but I mean, there's code word stuff in there," end of quote. Director Comey, what did General Petraeus mean when he said he intentionally shared, quote, code word information with her? What does that mean?
The Petraeus case, to my mind, illustrates perfectly the kind of cases the Department of Justice is willing to prosecute. Even there, they prosecuted him for a misdemeanor. In that case, you had vast quantities of highly classified information, including special sensitive compartmented information. That's the reference to code words. Vast quantity of it, not only shared with someone without authority to have it, but we found it in a search warrant hidden under the insulation in his attic, and then he lied to us about it during the investigation. So you have obstruction of justice, you have intentional misconduct, and a vast quantity of information. He admitted he knew that was the wrong thing to do. That is a perfect illustration of the kind of cases that get prosecuted. In my mind, it illustrates, importantly, the distinction to this case.
And General Petraeus did not admit to these facts when the FBI investigators first interviewed him, did he?
No, he lied about it.
But he did admit to these facts in a plea agreement, is that correct?
Yes.
Here's what the department filing said about General Petraeus, and I quote, The acts taken by defendant David Howell Petraeus were in all respects knowing and deliberate and were not committed by mistake, accident, or other innocent reason, end of quote. Is that an accurate summary in your view, Director Comey?
Yes, it actually leaves out an important part of the case, which is the obstruction of justice.
Was he charged with obstruction of justice?
No.
And why not?
A decision made by the leadership of the Department of Justice not to insist upon a plea to that felony.
So the question is, do you agree with the claim that General Petraeus, and I quote, got in trouble for far less, end of quote? Do you agree with that statement?
No, it's the reverse.
And what do you mean by that?
His conduct, to me, illustrates the categories of behavior that mark the prosecutions that are actually brought. Clearly intentional conduct, knew what he was doing was a violation of the law. Huge amounts of information that even if you couldn't prove he knew it, it raises the inference that he did it, right? An effort to obstruct justice. That combination of things makes it worthy of a prosecution. A misdemeanor prosecution, but a prosecution nonetheless.
Sitting here today, do you stand by the FBI's recommendation to prosecute General Petraeus?
Oh, yeah.
Do you stand by the FBI's recommendation not to prosecute Hillary Clinton?
Oh, yes.
Director Comey, how many times have you testified before Congress about the General Petraeus case? Do you know?
I don't think I've ever testified. I don't think I've testified about it at all. I don't think so.
With that, I'll yield back.
I have to check the record, but I believe I asked you a question about it at the time, but maybe not.
You could have. That's why I was,
yeah,
that's why I was
yeah.
squinching my face. It could have been at a Judiciary Committee hearing I was asked about it.
Yeah. We'll now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gowdy, for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Director Comey. Secretary Clinton said she never sent or received any classified information over her private email. Was that true?
Our investigation found that there was classified information sent.
So it was not true.
Right. That's what I said.
Okay. Well, I'm looking for a little shorter answer, so you and I are not here quite as long. Secretary Clinton said there was nothing marked classified on her emails, either sent or received. Was that true?
That's not true. There were a small number of portion markings on, I think, 3 of the documents.
Secretary Clinton said, I did not email any classified material to anyone on my email. There is no classified material. Was that true?
There was classified material emailed.
Secretary Clinton said she used just one device. Was that true?
She used multiple devices during the 4 years of her term as Secretary of State.
Secretary Clinton said all work-related emails were returned to the State Department. Was that true?
No, we found work-related emails, thousands, that were not returned.
Secretary Clinton said neither she nor anyone else deleted work-related emails from her personal account. Was that true?
That's a harder one to answer. We found traces of work-related emails on devices or in Slack space, whether they were deleted or whether when a server was changed out, something happened to them. There's no doubt that there were work-related emails that were removed electronically from the email system.
Secretary Clinton said her lawyers read every one of the emails and were overly inclusive. Did her lawyers read the email content individually?
No.
Well, in the interest of time, and because I have a plane to catch tomorrow afternoon, I'm not going to go through any more of the false statements, but I am going to ask you to put on your old hat. False exculpatory statements, they are used for what?
Well, either for a substantive prosecution or for evidence of intent in a criminal prosecution.
Exactly. Intent and consciousness of guilt, right? Is that right?
Right.
Consciousness of guilt and intent. In your old job, you would prove intent, as you just referenced, by showing the jury evidence of a complex scheme that was designed for the very purpose of concealing the public record. And you would be arguing, in addition to concealment, the destruction that you and I just talked about, or certainly the failure to preserve. You would argue all of that under the heading of intent. You would also be arguing the pervasiveness of the scheme, when it started, when it ended, and the number of emails, whether they were originally classified or up-classified. You would argue all of that under the heading of intent. You would also probably, under common scheme or plan, argue the burn bags of daily calendar entries or the missing daily calendar entries as a common scheme or plan to conceal. 2 days ago, Director, you said a reasonable person in her position should have known a private email was no place to send and receive classified information. You're right, an average person does know not to do that. This is no average person. This is a former First Lady, a former United States Senator, and a former Secretary of State that the President now contends is the most competent, qualified person to be president since Jefferson. He didn't say that in 2008, but he says it now. She affirmatively rejected efforts to give her a state.gov account. She kept these private emails for almost 2 years and only turned them over to Congress because we found out she had a private email account. So you have a rogue email system set up before she took the oath of office, thousands of what we now know to be classified emails, some of which were classified at the time. One of her more frequent email comrades was in fact hacked, and you don't know whether or not she was. And this scheme took place over a long period of time and resulted in the destruction of public records, and yet you say there is insufficient evidence of intent. You say she was extremely careless, but not intentionally so. You and I both know intent is really difficult to prove. Very rarely do defendants announce, on this date, I intend to break this criminal code section. Just to put everyone on notice, I am going to break the law on this date. It never happens that way. You have to do it with circumstantial evidence. Or if you're Congress and you realize how difficult it is to prove specific intent, you will formulate a statute that allows for gross negligence. My time is out, but this is really important. You mentioned there's no precedent for criminal prosecution. My fear is there still isn't. There's nothing to keep a future Secretary of State or President from this exact same email scheme or their staff. And my real fear is this. It's what the chairman touched upon. This double-track justice system that is rightly or wrongly perceived in this country. That if you are a private in the Army and you email yourself classified information, you will be kicked out. But if you are Hillary Clinton and you seek a promotion to Commander-in-Chief, you will not be. So what I hope you can do today is help the average person, the reasonable person you made reference to, the reasonable person understand why she appears to be treated differently than the rest of us would be. With that, I would yield back.
We'll now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Director, thank you for your years of public service. You have distinguished yourself as the Assistant U.S. Attorney for both the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of Virginia. That's why you were appointed by President Bush to be the Deputy Attorney General at the Department of Justice, and why President Obama appointed you as the Director of the FBI in 2013. Despite your impeccable reputation for independence and integrity, Republicans have turned on you with a vengeance immediately after you announced your recommendation not to pursue criminal charges against Secretary Clinton. Let me give you some examples. Representative Turner said, and I quote, "The investigation by the FBI is steeped in political bias," end quote. Was your investigation steeped in political bias, yes or no?
No, it was steeped in no kind of bias.
Thank you. The Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, was even more critical. He accused you of not applying the law equally. He said your recommendation shows, and I quote, "The Clintons are living above the law. They're being held to a different set of standards. That is clearly what this looks like," end quote. How do you respond to his accusations that you held the Clintons to a different set of standards than anyone else? Did you hold them to a different standard or the same standard?
It's just not accurate. We try very hard to apply the same standard whether you're rich or poor, white or black, old or young, famous or not known at all. I just hope folks will take the time to understand the other cases because there's a lot of confusion out there about what the facts were of the other cases that I understand lead good people, reasonable people to have questions.
Senator Cruz also criticized you. He said that there are, and I quote, serious concerns about the integrity of Director Comey's decision. He stated that you, quote, you had rewritten a clearly worded federal criminal statute. Did you rewrite the law in any way or rewrite any statute?
No.
Now, I truly hesitate to mention the next one. But Donald Trump took these conspiracy theories to a totally new level. He said, and I quote, it was no accident that charges were recommended against Hillary the exact same day as President Obama campaigned with her for the first time. So did you plan the timing of your announcement to help Secretary Clinton's campaign event on Tuesday?
No. Timing was entirely my own. Nobody knew I was going to do it, including the press. I'm very proud of the way the FBI, nobody leaked that. We didn't coordinate it, didn't tell, just not a consideration.
Thank you. Mr. Trump also claimed that Secretary Clinton bribed the Attorney General with an extension of her job. And I guess this somehow affected your decision. I know it's a ridiculous question, but I have to ask it. Did you make your decision because of some kind of bribe to the Attorney General?
No.
I tell you, are you surprised, as I am, by the intensity of the attacks from the GOP on you after having made a decision, a thoughtful decision, an independent decision with the professional staff of the FBI?
I'm not surprised by the intense interest and debate. I predicted it. I think it's important that we talk about these things. They inevitably become focused on individual people. That's okay. We'll just continue to have the conversation.
I believe that what we're seeing today is that if the GOP does not like the results of an investigation or how it turns out, and we saw they originally were lauding you, the minute you made your announcement, they're now attacking you, the same people. And now I predict they'll be calling for more hearings, more investigations, all at the expense of the taxpayer. And they do this instead of working on what the American people really care about. They want Congress to focus on jobs, the environment, homeland security, the security of our nation, affordable child care, affordable college educations, and an economy that works and helps all people. I thank you for performing your job with distinction and the long history of your whole profession of integrity and independence. And thank you very much. My time has expired.
Thank the gentlewoman. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for being with us. On Tuesday, you said any reasonable person in Secretary Clinton's position should have known that an unclassified system was no place for these conversations. You said on Tuesday some of her emails bore classified markings, and you also said on Tuesday there were potential violations of the appropriate statutes. Now, I know a bunch of prosecutors back home would look at that fact pattern, look at that evidence. You even referenced it in your opening statement. Some of your friends in the prosecution business have been on TV saying they'd have looked at that same evidence and they would have taken it to a grand jury. But on Tuesday you said, and today in your opening statement you said, no reasonable prosecutor would bring such a case. And then in your statement Tuesday you cite factors that helped you make that decision and make that statement. And one of the factors you said was consider the context of a person's actions. Now, typically when I hear context in the course of a criminal investigation, it's from the defense side, not the prosecution side. It's at the end of the case after there's been a trial and a guilty verdict, and it's during the sentencing phase, mitigating circumstances. That's the context we typically think about, but you said it on the front end. You said consider the context of the person's actions, and so I'm curious, what does consider the context mean? Because a lot of Americans are thinking just what the chairman talked about in his opening statement, that there are two standards, one for we the people and one for the politically connected. A lot of folks I get the privilege of representing back in Ohio think that when you said consider the context, they think that's what Mr. Gowdy just talked about, the fact that she's former First Lady, former Secretary of State, former Senator. major party's nominee for the highest office in the land, and oh, by the way, her husband just met with the individual you work with at an airport in Arizona 5 days ago. So you said none of that influenced your decision, but tell us what consider the context means.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Jordan. What I was trying to capture is the fact that the exercise of prosecutorial discretion is always a judgment call. It is in every single case. And among the things you consider are, what was this person's background? What was the circumstances of the offense? Were they drunk? Were they inflamed by passion? Was it somebody who had a sufficient level of education and training and experience that we can infer certain things from that, to consider the entire circumstances of the person's offense conduct and background? I did not mean to consider political context or things like that.
The entire circumstances, and Mr. Gowdy just talked about this scheme. Remember what she did, right? She sets up this unique server arrangement. She alone controls it. On that server, on that email system are her personal emails, her work-related emails, Clinton Foundation information, and now we know classified information. This gets discovered. We find out this arrangement exists. Then what happens? Her lawyers, her legal team decides which ones we get and which ones they get to keep. They made the sort on the front end. And then we find out the ones that they kept and didn't give to us, didn't give to the American people, didn't give to Congress, the ones they kept, they destroyed them. And you don't have to take my word, I'll take what you said on Tuesday. They deleted all emails that they did not return to the State Department, and the lawyers cleaned their devices in such a way as to preclude complete forensic recovery. Now that sounds like a fancy way of saying they hid the evidence, right? And you just told Mr. Gowdy thousands of emails fell into those categories. Now, that seems to me to provide some context to what took place here. Did Secretary Clinton's legal team, excuse me, let me ask it this way. Did Secretary Clinton know her legal team deleted those emails that they kept from us?
I don't believe so.
Did Secretary Clinton approve those emails being deleted?
I don't think there was any specific instruction or conversation between the Secretary and her lawyers about that.
Did you ask that question?
Yes.
Did Secretary Clinton know that her lawyers cleaned devices in such a way as to preclude complete forensic recovery?
I don't believe that she did.
Did you ask that question?
Yes.
Do you see how someone could view the context of what she did? Set up a private system. She alone controlled it. She kept everything on it. We now know from Ms. Abedin's deposition that they did it for that very reason, so no one could see what was there, based on the deposition Ms. Abedin gave. And then when they got caught, they deleted what they had, and they scrubbed their devices. Is that part of the context in evaluating this decision?
Sure, sure. And understand what inferences can be drawn from that collection of facts, of course.
All right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Comey, I appreciate your conduct of this investigation in a nonpartisan way, in keeping with the sterling reputation which has led presidents of both parties to appoint you to highly placed law enforcement positions in our federal government. I want to say for the record that this hearing, where you call the prosecutor and Mr. Comey stands in the place of the prosecutor, because the Attorney General has accepted entirely the FBI's recommendations, where you call the prosecutor to give account for the decision to prosecute or not. A particular individual raises serious questions of separation of powers, and particularly when you're questioning the prosecutor's decision with respect to the decision to prosecute or not a particular individual, it raises serious bill of attainder constitutional questions. These hearings are so often accusatory that they yield no guidance as to how to conduct business in the future. And that's the way it looks. It looks as though that is how this hearing is going. Now, of course, now everyone understands in the abstract why it is important for security reasons to use official government mail or email rather than private email if security matters are involved. And that's a very broad, wide proposition. Now, there are no rules, so far as I know, requiring members of Congress to use their, as to how they use their official email accounts, whether involving security or not. The chairman of this committee lists his personal account, for example, on his business card. No one says that's wrong. I don't know if it's wrong or right, because there's no guidance. Federal agency employees, members of Congress often have secure information, or at least sensitive information that shouldn't be made public. Some of our members are on the Intelligence Committee or the Defense Committee or even this committee and may have such matters. Some of these matters may concern national security issues. I don't know, if something as sensitive as the itinerary, as if you're going on a Codell, as to the route you are taking and where you will be, all that could be on people's personal emails. Of course, this is legislative branch, and I spoke of separation of powers. I'm not indicating that there should be a government-wide sense that is ordained from on high, but there ought to be rules that everybody understands about, especially after the Clinton episode, about the use of personal email. So I'd like your insight for guidance as far as other federal employees are concerned, or even members of Congress and their staff, because I think we could learn from this episode. So strictly from a security standpoint, do you believe that federal employees, staff, even members of Congress should attempt guidance on the issue of the use of personal emails versus some official form of communication? What should we learn from the process the Secretary has gone through? I'm sure there will be questions about how there was even confusion, for example, in the State Department. But what should we learn when it comes to our own use of email or the use of federal employees on this question?
May I answer, Mr. Chairman? The most important thing to learn is that an unclassified email system is no case for an email conversation about classified matters. And by that I mean either sending a document as an attachment over unclassified email that is classified, or having a conversation about something that is a classified subject on an unclassified email system. That's the focus of the concern. That's the focus of this investigation. That it was also a personal email adds to the concern about the case because of the security vulnerabilities associated with a personal system. But the root of the problem is people using unclassified systems to conduct business that is classified. And so all of us should have access to, if we have access to classified information, classified communication systems. Right? The FBI has 3 levels: unclassified system, a secret system, and a top secret system. You can email on all 3, but you need to make sure you don't email on the unclassed system, even if that's a government classified system, about matters that are classified. That's the important lesson to learn. Everybody ought to be aware of it. Everybody ought to be trained on it. We spend a lot of time training on it in the FBI to make sure folks are sensitive to the need to move a classified discussion, even if it doesn't involve sending a document, to the appropriate forum.
Members of Congress included.
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We'll now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. DeSantis, for 5 minutes.
Director, and the reason why that's so important is because if top secret information is compromised, that could damage our national security, correct?
Yes, by definition.
And American lives are at stake in some instances, correct?
Yes.
You mentioned a lot of people are upset that there are no consequences for Secretary Clinton, but in your statement you did point out that administrative and security consequences would be appropriate if someone demonstrated extreme carelessness for classified information. So those consequences, that would include potentially termination of federal employment?
Correct.
It could include revocation of security clearance?
Yes.
And it could include ineligibility for future employment in national security positions, correct?
It could.
Now, would you, as the FBI director, allow someone in the employ of your agency to work in a national security capacity if that person had demonstrated extreme carelessness in handling top secret info?
The best answer to that is we would look very closely at that in a suitability determination. It's hard to answer in the abstract, yes in all cases, no in all cases, but it would be a very important suitability scrub.
So there would be instances where someone could be extremely careless but still maintain confidence? I mean, we have a lot of people who are very competent in this country who would love to work for your agency, but yet it would be potentially you would allow somebody to be extremely careless and continue on?
That's the trouble with answering the hypothetical. I could imagine if it was a long time ago and it was a small amount of conduct or something, that's why it's hard to say other than it would be a very important part of
Let's just put it this way. Would being extremely careless in handling top secret information expose an employee of the FBI to potential termination?
Yes.
Why shouldn't U.S. officials use mobile devices when traveling to foreign countries, especially if they're discussing classified or sensitive information?
Because the mobile device will transmit its signal across networks that are likely controlled or at least accessed by that hostile power.
And that's the guidance that the FBI gives all officials when they're traveling overseas. That's still good guidance, correct?
That's good guidance.
How did top secret information end up on the private server? Because your statement addressed Secretary Clinton. You did not address any of her aides in your statement. Attorney General Lynch exonerated everybody. That information just didn't get there on its own. So how did it get there? Were you able to determine that?
Yes, by people talking about a top secret subject in an email communication.
So it was
It's not about forwarding a top secret document. It's about having a conversation about a matter that is top secret.
And those were things that were originated by Secretary Clinton's aides and then sent to her, which was obviously being her server, but it was also included Secretary Clinton originating those emails, correct?
That's correct. In most circumstances, it initiated with aides starting a conversation. In the one involving top secret information, Secretary Clinton, though, also not only received but also sent emails that talked about the same subject.
And of that top secret information that you found, would somebody who was sophisticated in those matters, should it have been obvious to them that that was very sensitive information?
Yes.
So I guess my issue about knowledge of what you're doing is, in order for Secretary Clinton to have access to top secret SCI information, didn't she have to sign a form with the State Department acknowledging her duties and responsibilities under the law to safeguard this information?
Yes. Anybody who gets access to SCI, sensitive compartmented information, would sign what's called a read-in form that lays that out. I'm sure members of Congress have seen the same thing.
And it stresses in that document, and other training people would get, that there are certain requirements to handling certain levels of information. For example, a top secret document, that can't even be on your secret system at the FBI, correct?
Correct.
So you have to follow certain guidelines. And I guess my question is she's a very sophisticated person. She did execute that document, correct?
Yes.
And her aides who were getting the classified information, they executed similar documents to get a security clearance, correct?
I believe so.
And she knowingly, clearly set up her own private server in order to, well, actually, let me ask you that. Was the reason she set up her own private server, in your judgment, because she wanted to shield communications from Congress and from the public?
I can't say that. Our best information is she set it up as a matter of convenience. It was an already existing system that her husband had, and she decided to have a domain on that system.
So the question is very sophisticated. This is information that clearly anybody who had knowledge of security information would know that it would be classified. But I'm having a little bit trouble to see, how would you not then know that that was something that was inappropriate to do.
Well, I just want to take one of your assumptions about sophistication. I don't think that our investigation established that she was actually particularly sophisticated with respect to classified information and the levels and the treatment. And so far as we can tell,
Isn't she an original classification authority, though?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good grief. Well, I appreciate you coming, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record two documents that Mr. DeSantis referred to. One is the sensitive compartmented information non-disclosure agreement. The other one is the classified information non-disclosure agreement, both signed by Hillary Rodham Clinton. Without objection, so ordered. Now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Clay, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Comey, for being here today and for the professionals whom you lead at the FBI. 2 years ago, after my urgent request to then former Attorney General Eric Holder,
following the death last night. We pray, loving God, that in ways that we cannot, that you will be present with a powerful peace that gives strength and stamina, that gives vision and voice to those whose voices have long been silenced. We pray that you, as only you can, will open the eyes of the privileged, that you will sweep clean the pathways of hearts that have been closed and the hallways where injustice has been status quo. We pray that as the days move forward, you will bring imagination and wisdom, born of both compassion and passion for justice. Gracious God, your timing is not our timing. You call us to hope that is beyond what we can do, but that must be lived out in what we do together. And so we pray that from this moment forward, we might respond to the opportunities for reconciliation that you give us, that we might speak truth in love, and that we might live as your good and faithful people. We ask this prayer in these humble words, but our hearts are filled with prayers for which we can find no words. We ask them all in your name and pray your guiding and comfort and justice.
As Pastor Connolly said, we're grateful to our governor for calling for a swift investigation by the U.S. Justice Department to ensure that the investigation is fair, to ensure that it's transparent, and to ensure that it moves swiftly. And we thank our mayor for joining in that. Our DA has said that he has turned this investigation over to the U.S. Department of Justice, and we appreciate that. But the message of the day simply is this, that we urge the Justice Department to conduct an investigation beyond just civil rights, and we want them to publicly acknowledge that they will expand the scope of their investigation to include possible other charges that is a violation of both state and local laws. Without that, it's quite possible that we will not get all information that we need about what has happened. Also, we want them to be as transparent as they can possibly be. We understand investigation takes time, but we want them to share with the public what their findings are. And if they find any state or federal laws, local laws have been violated, that they recommend charges to the DA that appropriate action be taken for the violation of those laws. We don't want this to get lost just in a civil rights violation, because possibly other laws were violated. We want to make sure that they are investigated as well, and if there are findings that those laws were violated, that information be made public and it is turned over to the DA that he can take the appropriate action. That's the message of the day. Again, while we grieve with the family, We want to make sure that this investigation is broad as possible, that it is transparent, that that information is given to the public, and that recommendations are made to the local authorities as to appropriate action that should be taken. Okay. I'm Pastor Lee Wesley, pastor of Community Bible Baptist Church here in Baton Rouge, and also a founding member of Together Baton Rouge. We want to thank all our public officials who are with us today. If there are any in the audience, we want you to join us up here because we recognize the hard work that you do. You've been out front of this, and I'm convinced that because of your work that we've had no violence thus far, and we continue to pray that there will be no violence as a result of this. So thank you so much, public officials, for all the work that you've done in this. I think it's evident of the kind of community we have when blacks and whites come together, citizens and public officials, to do what is the right thing to do, to have some resolution to this in a way that there is no violence, destruction of property in our community. It speaks well of the citizens of the city of Baton Rouge. Brother Aikman.
What's your name, sir?
Pardon?
Your name, sir?
Lee Wesley.
Good morning. My name is Edgar Cage. I'm with the Episcopal Diocese of Louisiana. And if you know Together Baton Rouge, we are not just about one single action. We're just not about doing one thing one time. This is our first press conference, but it won't be our last, because we plan to use this event, this tragic event, as a tool, as a stimulus for us to change the culture and ways that our community operates, especially as it goes on about investigations of police officers' abuse. We want to see a change in the community on that. So as it progresses, we will take the appropriate action and ask the appropriate questions and make the appropriate demands as this investigation continues. But as Reverend Wesley said, the most important thing is we don't want this to be a very narrow investigation. We want it to be broad. We want to have all the possibilities on the table. Don't take anything off the table. All the resources and all the possible charges that could come from this investigation, we want to be included. And we anticipate and hope and respect that this will be done, and we will be there to make sure that it's done, that the investigation is transparent, it's open. And another thing I just want to add is that it may take a little time. We need to have a little patience because we want it done correctly. We're not talking about quickly. We want it done correctly first. That's the most important factor. So we're asking the community to be a little patient. We can still be nonviolent, but be a little patient as this investigation continues. And we want to thank everybody involved who helped us get to where we are, and we hope that this thing can come to some sort of conclusion fairly quickly. Now I will.
Any questions from the press? Any questions?
Have you talked to one more about your concerns about this? Have you reached out to the district attorney's office or the governor's office or anybody to talk about what you would like to see happen?
We've not talked to the DA. We met with the governor a couple of days ago when he shared with a group of pastors the action that he has taken. We will be talking to the DA to let him know that we're calling for a full investigation by the U.S. Justice Department, and that we're asking them to recommend any charges that need to be brought as a result of this incident.
And we want to go on record in making these demands, not that we let them slip by. We want it to be known that this is the anticipation and the expectation of this investigation.
Do you understand there's a fine line when it comes to investigations, especially high profile like this, where they may not be able to reveal to the public all the steps along the way? It may not be a lack of transparency, it may just be the investigatory process.
Sure, we understand that, and we're asking them to reveal to the public as they can what their findings are. But we're patient to wait until the end of the investigation and not to assume anything until all the facts are in. So we understand that. Understand this also. It's not that we don't trust our local officials. That's not the point at all. It's hard to investigate yourself. And even if you're investigating yourself, it gives the appearance that maybe something was not revealed that needs to be revealed. So this moves all the questions out of the way and gives us a complete, transparent, fair, honest investigation. And that's what we're calling for, and that's what the public wants.
And as I said before, we want it to be done correctly. We don't want a technicality to come up where, you know, it can dismiss maybe some relevant information. So we want it done correctly.
Any other questions?
The governor's meeting with the U.S. Attorney and the FBI today. Over here, sorry.
Right here, right here.
Yeah.
Right.
I hear you, but I can't see you. Say it again.
The governor's meeting with the FBI and state police today. What's your message to them? What would you like to see in that meeting?
The message to them is simply this: expand the scope of the investigation. Make it as broad as possible. Whatever your findings are, make those findings public and recommend to the local authorities if any action needs to be taken.
Broad and thorough. Want the investigation to be thorough.
You all spoke about saying that you don't want division amongst the community, but do you believe there's already division between the police department and the community now?
Can we repeat the question?
Sure. I think the question was, we don't want division, but is there any division among the police department now?
Amongst the community and the police department.
There is an element of distrust, and it did not happen overnight. It did not happen because of this incident. It's an ongoing thing. So, and one of the things we'll be discussing later on in our next meeting of Together Baton Rouge is how we can help build better relationship between the police department and our community. But to say that no distrust of that would not be a true statement at all. Yeah, that is an element of distrust. Yes, sir.
The investigation has to proceed past just what happened at the scene. There have been cases in the past in the city of New Orleans, for example, where the feds have dug into things and found that there may have been cover-ups after the crime was committed. Is that something that concerns you, and is that something that you feel they have to look into as well? Not just what happened at the scene, but what happened in the hours and days afterwards?
We're calling for a thorough investigation. Includes all aspects before, after, or whatever elements that are relevant to the case is what we're calling for.
I may very well find during this investigation some systemic problems within the department itself. If that's the case, we'd want them to reveal what those problems are, and we'd want them to be addressed as well. We don't want another incident as this one. And the way you avoid that is looking at all of the problems that exist and addressing them, beyond the scope of just what happened with Mr. Sterling.
Do you feel like this incident was representative of how the police department treats this community, or was it more of a statistical outlier?
No, I think it's an isolated incident. I don't think it's would be. Do we view this as a part of the police department? No, I think it's an isolated incident, and I don't think it represents most of our police department, their thought processes, their feelings. So, no, I don't.
But it may be an isolated incident, but we want it to be the last incident. We want to take appropriate measures where this does not happen again to anybody in our community or any community. So it's still tragic, even though it may be isolated, it's tragic. And one incident of this type is too many.
Are you worried that the burden of proof for the civil rights violations, they had to intentionally violate the civil rights? Do you think that might be too hard to get to?
And the question is whether or not the burdens of proof are high with civil rights violation. They may not be able to meet that burden. That is a concern of ours. And again, that's why we want the scope of the investigation to go way beyond just civil rights violations. But if there are some civil rights violations, we want those to be prosecuted as well.
What are your thoughts on the recent protests?
What are my thoughts on the recent protests is the question. People ought to be able to express themselves. There's a lot of anger out there. Emotions are high. They ought not be pent up. So people ought to have an opportunity to protest. That's the American way, to express their opinion, to release the frustration that they have. And we honor that as long as it is done in a nonviolent fashion where people are not hurt and property is not destroyed. So we think that's in order. That's the American way.
What is your opinion that Taylor Moore's edicts of the national press conducting themselves similar to local press is?
Say it again, I didn't hear you.
Taylor Moore's last statement very specifically stated that the national press should conduct themselves the way the local press has.
Well, that's Mr. Moore's personal opinion. I would not want to comment on why he feels that way. Any other questions?
A general consensus in a lot of these protests is that people are tired of meeting, but they want results now. Is there any time frame as to when a result of action is going to come about this?
People are looking for answers, not just to what happened with Mr. Sterling, but what has been happening over the years. But even in the midst of that, if you just plow into it without taking the appropriate time to really dig into the problems, not just dealing with the symptoms of the problem, but the problem itself, it takes time to do that. And that's why we call on the community, as Mr. Egger has said, to be patient with this investigation and not to make any decisions until after the investigation is completed.
And as I said before, Together Baton Rouge, look at what's up on the stage. This would have never happened before Together Baton Rouge was formed. We are about building bridges, bringing communities together, people of various and different backgrounds. So, and we're not just about talk, we're about action. And we will use this tragic incident as a means of bridging the gap between those communities or those institutions like the police that are currently divided to have some action to come together as one.
Any other questions?
Will you all advocate for any procedural change to the police department, equipment, hiring, control?
Yes, that's some of the things that we will be discussing later. We don't want to dilute what's the main issue today, but that's one of the things that we'll be discussing later.
I want to close just with repeating the main purpose of this press conference, and that is we as a community faith-based organization call up on the Justice Department to expand their investigation beyond just civil rights, to consider the possibility of any state or local laws that have been violated, and if so, to make recommendations to the DA that he takes the appropriate action. Thank you so much. I have one announcement before we close out.
Yes, the clergy of our city have come together, and on tonight at 6 o'clock at Living Faith on Winburn, Bishop Raymond Johnson is the senior pastor there. There will be a prayer vigil on tonight. We're invited the community to come out. This will be an opportunity for you to actually get an opportunity to see religious leaders speaking into this issue as well in prayer.
Again, we want to thank everyone for coming out to Wesley United Methodist Church. I am Pastor Dr. Joe Conley. Also today at noon, the United Methodist Church is having a prayer conference, a prayer vigil, downtown North Boulevard at the Square. We invite you all to come out for a time of focused prayer. Again, media, thank you for coming out, being part of our city. We also want to remind our citizens, our cousins, our friends, our mamas, our daddies, our uncles, continue to protest, but continue to protest without violence. When we are nonviolent, we can cause people to respond, to look up, and again, help change Baton Rouge. Together, Baton Rouge, we stand united. Let's thank everyone for what you've done. Sterling family, we're with you. Baton Rouge, we're with you. Together, united, we cannot be defeated. Thank you all for coming out this morning.
I understand, bro. Yes, thanks. Thank you so much.